Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today to speak out. Before we start, do I need unanimous consent to speak for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes?
The senator is free to speak.
Thank you. Madam President, I come to the floor today to speak out against the GMO labeling bill that we'll be considering a little bit later this week or next week, and raise concerns for the millions of American families who want to know and who have the right to know exactly what is in their food. I have come to the floor before to endorse GMO labeling legislation and to oppose efforts to keep folks in the dark when it comes to what they feed their families. This is an issue that impacts each and every one of us. Every day, there's nothing more important than choosing the food that we are about to eat. Food provides us with nutrition and energy. Good food helps our kids grow strong and helps us remain healthy as we get older. I strongly believe that when folks decide what food to purchase, they do so and should do so with all the information that they have available to them. Unfortunately, members of this body want to keep folks in the dark. They don't want consumers to know exactly what's in the food they're eating. This fight is nothing new. Back in 2013, I was here on the floor fighting against a piece of legislation called the Monsanto Protection Act, which gave blanket immunity to major seed companies whose products had been or could be a target of litigation. And earlier this year, I was in this chamber to fight against the Dark Act, which trampled on the rights of states and consumers alike at the request of the food industry. Now, once again, the Senate GMO labeling bill provides major food corporations with an out, where they can hide behind a complex QR code to prevent folks from knowing if their food contains genetically modified organisms. And it brings into question the very definition of bioengineering. And it raises concerns about the growing influence that agribusiness has on this body. You see, Madam President, this bill before us raises all these major concerns and much more. Besides keeping folks in the dark and besides telling states that they cannot write their own consumer information laws, this bill gives the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, complete authority to unilaterally interpret and implement the controversial provisions of this bill. And to make things worse, this is not a collaborative bill. This bill provides corporate agribusiness with handout after handout, but it really doesn't do a thing for family farm producers and the small mom and pop shops, the operations that are backbones of our farming economy. Quite frankly, it undermines the work of organic producers and it ignores the folks who purchase organic products. To me, it is clear. This is a one-sided bill, a bill that benefits multinational corporations at the expense of family farmers and ranchers. So to be more specific, I want to talk about four major problems that I have with this bill. First, this bill mandates that companies who use genetically engineered ingredients disclose that information on the packaging. On the surface, this looks like a step forward. But as we dig a little deeper, the bill allows the companies to meet this mandate in three ways: a written label on the package, which would be fine; a symbol created by the USDA, which could also be fine; but then we have this, the QR barcode that folks have to scan using their smartphone to figure out whether it has genetically modified ingredients in the food that they are about to buy. Yes, this bill allows companies to meet the disclosure requirement with this, a QR barcode. And if you can tell me what that says by looking at it, you're a much smarter man than I. The bill before us today specifically mandates that the words next to QR code say, "Scan here for more information." Those are the words in the bill. So if folks want to know if their cereal contains commodities that originated in a lab, rather than read it right on a package, clear as a bell, rather than read the words on a package, they will first have to know that the QR code will provide them with information and whether that information, that product contains GMOs, and not just more than marketing information or a coupon. You would have to know that the phrase more food information means information about GMOs, maybe, maybe not. Then they would scan that code into their phone, and hopefully they'd have cell service in that grocery store. But what happens if they don't? That's not transparency. That's not the consumer's right to know. They could not tell. But if you somehow know that the phrase more food information means, and you're fortunate enough to have Wi-Fi in your grocery store, you'll be directed to a website. And then maybe you can learn about what's really in the food, potentially genetically engineered products, although it's not clear what else you'll have to read about or where that information will be hidden within that website. And for other companies, maybe those who aren't as big as the big international agribusinesses, they will be allowed to hide that important information behind an 800 number. For mom or dad who wants to know what's in her child's soup or bread, they'll have to call many different 800 numbers in the aisles of the grocery store, or scan many, many of these QR codes. Anybody who's ever gone to a grocery store with a small child in tow knows that's not going to happen. It's probably not even going to happen if you don't have a small child in tow, quite frankly. Between these ridiculous QR codes and the 1-800 numbers, mom or dad could easily end up standing in a grocery store for hours, scanning each individual product with a smartphone or dialing an international call center just to find out basic information about what they're going to eat. This is completely ridiculous, a nightmare for consumers, an illusion of transparency. What if companies were allowed to use QR codes instead of basic nutritional information? What if you had to scan a barcode to find out how much fat was in a bag of chips, how much protein is in a can of beans, or how much vitamin C is in a jug of orange juice? And the only clue you had was scan here for more information. You know, it's interesting. When I go to a store and buy orange juice, I buy orange juice that's not made from concentrate. It's my choice. I can read it right on the package. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know if that orange juice is any better than the stuff that's made from concentrate. But it's written on the package, so I can determine what orange juice I want to buy. So if you don't want to buy food, or if you want to buy food with GMOs in it, you get to scan this little doodad up here, this QR code, and then maybe, if you hit the right web page, you can find out what's in the food. We did this as a Senate. We did this to allow people to know what's in their food. And we actually think that this is an effective method to let people know what's in their food. How would folks in Congress react if lobbyists and dark money campaigns began pushing to get all nutrition label off our foods? The same way that this bill hides origins of our food. I can tell you there'd be a ton of folks here on the floor. They'd be raising big, big hell, rather than just a handful who really aren't afraid of Monsanto or the other massive food corporations. Hiding basic information behind barcodes and 800 numbers is totally unacceptable. The United States Senate should not be in the business of hiding information from consumers. When I grew up, I was always told the consumer's always right. We should be empowering those consumers, those American consumers, with more information about their food that they purchase, not with less. Don't take it from me, 9 out of 10 consumers say they want labeling required for genetically engineered foods. What's the problem with that? It's already done in 64 countries. When you bring up the issue of consumer rights, of the ability of individuals to have some idea where their food comes, you're told that GMOs are perfectly safe. But that response completely misses the point and insults every single person who has ever asked about their source of food. What this is really about, it's about consumers' right to know, not with a Mickey Mouse QR code, Not with an 800 number that's different on every package of food that you're going to pick up, but with simple words that say, product contains GM or it doesn't. That'll allow the consumer to make his choices. That will allow mothers and fathers around this country to be empowered, not to be controlled. 64 countries, including places you would never ever think of transparency, places like Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, require GMO labeling. Now, we're going to say, if this bill passes, and it had 68 votes last time it came to the floor, that we have GMO labeling. That is a joke. We've got a Mickey Mouse GMO labeling law. So why is the United States the only developed country in the world that doesn't require an easy-to-read GMO label on their foods, or an easy symbol that signifies it? There's a one-word answer: money. Here's an example. In 2012, California's Proposition 37, which would have required GMO labeling, opponents of that labeling bill spent $45 million to defeat that proposition. Supporters of that labeling bill spent about $7 million. In fact, Monsanto alone spent $8 million. They outspent the supporters alone. That was in 2012. In 2013, Washington State had an initiative called 522, which required GMO labeling. More than $20 million was spent in opposition. $600 of that came from Washington residents, by the way. About $7 million was spent in support of the campaign. $1.6 million came from Washington residents. These campaigns and lobbying organizations have spent nearly $500 million to prevent common sense labeling standards, and we have caved to that. If these countries are proud of GMO products, they should label them. Make it a marketing tool. Instead, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to defeat common sense measures that 90% of the public of this country supports, because they're afraid that the word GMO would hurt their billion-dollar profits. I'm not asking for a skull and crossbones on the package. This isn't about safety or health of these products. It's about transparency. It's about the public's right to know. It's about putting families ahead of corporations. It's about valuing consumers' right to know over lobbyists and their slick suits and their influence here. They're denying consumers an easy-to-read national GMO label standard. Why? They're denying folks the transparency they need to make the best decisions for their family. It makes no sense to me. The second issue that I have with this bill is the way it changes the definition of GMOs in a way that will not be good for consumers. To me, it is pretty simple. If a crop is found and developed in nature, then God had his hand in making that. Products that have been genetically modified or engineered in a lab, well, those products are made by man. They're genetically engineered. But in this bill, the definition of GMO is very different. And this definition is very dangerous, and it will be a major mistake if it becomes a new national standard. As the bill currently reads, the term bioengineering requires food to contain genetic material that has been not modified by our DNA techniques, and for which the modification could not otherwise happen through conventional breeding or found in nature. It sounds harmless enough, but there's some huge problems with this definition. First, our DNA techniques are not the only way we modify plants or animals. Scientists can use cell fusion, macroinjection, gene deletion, gene editing, and that's just been what's been invented today. Tomorrow there will be other things that they can do to manipulate the genes. The next problem is that the definition requires the food products to contain genetic material that has been modified by our DNA. That's it. Now, there are a handful of products that are so refined that the final product would not be listed as GMO even when the original plant is GMO. Soybean oil, high fructose corn syrup, give you an example. So not to get in the weeds too far, but organics are certified a process. They certify the process that a plant goes through. And if you don't have water-soluble fertilizers, and if you don't spray it with herbicides, and you have a soil building program and a good crop rotation and all those kind of things, you can get it certified as organic. That would mean that, the way I read this, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'll bet you we'll find out in the courts, because we've got a lot of lawyers with smiles on their face if we get this passed. That would mean that you could take a GMO corn, for example, raise it under organic standards, because the oil does not show that it's modified rDNA, could be organic. That means that Roundup Ready, soybeans, corn, could ultimately be excluded from labeling of the GMO QR code. Folks will be purchasing products they think are GMO-free when nothing's further from the truth. And I'm not talking about obscure products. I'm talking about very common ingredients. This is a huge loophole, and one that was created on purpose. And why? Because I will tell you, if you control the food supply, you control the people. In this country right now, we have very limited competition in the marketplace. When you go sell your grain or your cattle, it doesn't matter. There's not much competition out there, because there's just a few major multinational agribusiness companies that are your market. So that's controlled. You go buy inputs for your crop, fertilizer, sprays, just a few companies. No competition in that. Well, they haven't had control of the seed until recently, and now they're getting control of it in a big, big way. Farmer's always had control of his own seed, always been able to keep his own seed and use it the next year. Not anymore. And this bill will promote that going into the future. And we ask why people are leaving rural America. We ask why towns are drying up. We ask why farms are going away. All we do is look at this body, and you'll answer those questions. The GMO labeling bill, this GMO labeling bill, will exclude some of the most prevalent GMO products in our marketplace. You think that was done by accident? I think not. The second part of the definition refers to modifications that can be found in nature. It's extremely vague, also threatens transparency, but you know what? There are some natural gene modifications that happen in bacteria, not plants, not animals, in bacteria. Under this definition, that provides another unnecessary loophole that will impact consumers, because it says it's okay if it's found in nature. So we've got a QR code. We've got a really bad definition, by the way, and they could have used the other definition, the one that's the standard across the world. They chose not to. They put this definition and said, only, the good thing about this is it only applies to this bill. So it's okay, don't worry about it. Oof. The third problem I have with this bill is it gives the USDA incredible rule-making power. It allows them to determine what percentage of GMO ingredients would be in the label. It gives the department the power to establish a national standard with that information. If that isn't enough, the USDA then will design all forms of food disclosure, whether it's text, whether it's symbol, or an electronic digital link. The department also must provide alternative labeling options for small packages. And finally, the agency must consider establishing consistency between the labeling standard in this bill and the Organic Food Productions Act of 1990. Now, why the heck would that be in there? For the very same reason I talked about earlier. You could literally have a GMO plant be raised under organic conditions, and I believe because of this bill, it could be certified organic. But all of this power that I just talked about would be given to unelected bureaucrats in an office building here in Washington, D.C., quite a large office building, and they're going to make the decisions, and we in production agriculture are going to have to live with them. The last point I want to make is how this bill is going to negatively impact the organic industry, and I know there's been folks come to the floor and talk about how it's going to be great for organics. But the truth is the organic industry is one of the bright spots in production agriculture, quite frankly. For the last 30 years, it's grown between 10 and 30% a year. Grew 11% last year. As a matter of fact, $43 billion in sales, which isn't much in the overall food system, but to organics, it's moved quite impressively along. So I would ask, what good does this bill do for organics? Well, I'll tell you what it does. It states that products that are not required to label GMOs don't automatically qualify for non-GMO status, which, why not? That's kind of a given. It also states that organic certification is a means of verifying non-GMO claims in the marketplace. Look, I've been through organic certifications for this farm's organic. I've been through organic certification now for 30 years next year. And I can tell you one of the first questions the inspector asks when he comes on the farm is, where'd you get your seed? And is it GMO? Because GMOs are flatly forbidden in the organic system. So what they're saying is they're saying what we already have, that organic certifications is a means of verifying non-GMO claims. The fact is, if I used GMO plants, I would not be organic. And neither would anybody else in production agriculture that uses GMO plants. So that's a biggie, gives us what we already have. And it clarifies that the narrow definition of GMOs and biotechnology in this bill, remember that definition we had up a minute ago, only applicable to labeling, only applicable to this bill, and not other relevant regulations like the organic rule, which is what we already have. This bill falls drastically short. And I know there are trade organizations like the Organic Trade Association, and I know there are big companies out there that have said that this is perfect. Go ahead and move forward. I'm telling you, they haven't read the bill. They haven't looked at the requirements. They haven't looked at hiding behind a QR code. They haven't looked at the definition and what its real impacts could be. They haven't looked at giving the United States Department of Agriculture incredible latitude. And then when it's all done, we got to live with it. In the end, the result would be that this country will have a different production system, I believe. I hope this has positive impacts on production agriculture. As I look at legislation that we pass around here, I ask myself, is this going to help revitalize rural America, or is this going to continue the relocation of people in small town America going away? I've said many, many times on this floor, this is a great country. One of the reasons it's great is because we've had a great public education system, and we've had family farm agriculture, and I believe if we lose either one of those, this country will change, and it will change for the worse. I think this piece of legislation is not a step in the right direction for family farm agriculture. Look, this is a picture of my farm. You know, my grandfather came to this area from the Red River Valley in 1910. When he came out, the place didn't look like this. It was grass. In fact, this really wasn't his homestead. He traded my great uncle a team of horses for this place. There wasn't anything there. There used to be an old house that sat here. That was the homestead shack, sat right there. It was a pretty nice old house. That's what he built first. And then after he patented in 1915, he built this barn in 1916. Now you got to remember, back then they had nails and hammers. That's it. Didn't have any pneumatics, didn't have any hydraulics. Him and his neighbors got together, they built that barn in 1916. Colder than old Billy out. But they had to have that barn because that barn was where they had their animals. They farmed with horses then. Unfortunately, 2 years after he built it, a tornado came through, a cyclone, flattened it. He built it again, 1919. Rebuilt the doggone thing. Just got out there, didn't have nothing, a bunch of grass, and puts all this money, and that's a pretty good sized barn, by the way. Blew it down, he rebuilt it. And then in 1920, they had a drought, and he had to move back to North Dakota because they were starving to death. My mom was born back in North Dakota that year, 1920. And then they moved back a couple of years later and survived the dirty 30s. My folks took over in the early 40s. Dad built that butcher shop. That's where this happened. We put up the shop here, which is this equivalent to this. This is where we take care of our equipment now. This farm today is 1,800 acres. It was 1,200 acres for a good many years. We were able to add another 600 acres to it 20 years ago. This farm, it's about a third of the size of the average farm in eastern Montana, by the way, has supported 2 families for its entire life, with the exception of the first 20 years, and with the exception of when my mom passed in 2009, because my dad passed 5 years earlier. It's a great place. It's part of who I am. It's bills like this. Not the dirty 30s, not the Great Depression, not the attack on Pearl Harbor, not the mass exodus in the 1980s. Bills like this that will remove my family from this farm after over 100 years. So when we take up pieces of legislation like this, and they're not good pieces of legislation, and we go, okay, this is a great country. It is a great country. We just celebrated our 240th anniversary. And we take up pieces of legislation and say, well, it'll be all right. Things will get better. Guess what? Things don't get better. And things aren't getting better in rural America. And the reason is because we're getting swallowed up by agribusiness. We don't make a move anymore without agribusiness. And let me give you an example. Take your product to the marketplace. You got a couple people that'll bid on it. Go buy your inputs. You got a couple people you can buy them from. It won't be long, folks, where we'll be paying taxes on the land, and we'll be providing the labor, and the profits will go to the big guys, the guys who can never get enough. This bill will help facilitate that happening. I fully anticipate come Monday or whenever we vote on this that there's going to be enough votes to pass this, because a lot of the folks have read the propaganda put out that we got to have this kind of stuff to feed the world. That may be true. I've never bought that, but it may be true. But the truth is shouldn't the consumer at least know what's on the food they're eating? Shouldn't they at least have a clue? Shouldn't they at least be given the right in the greatest country in the world? Shouldn't we have more transparency than Russia, not less? We'll see what happens on Monday or whenever we vote on the GMO bill. I do appreciate Senator Stabenow's work on this bill. Unfortunately, it falls woefully short of what we need in this country as far as transparency on our food. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.